Okay, you ready? Welcome back to the Narc Me. We have one of my favorite guests back, Lisa Sunny from Stronger Than Before. If you find her on social, that's her handle, Stronger Than Before. And Lisa is a trauma bond recovery coach. She's best known for her course, which if you are coming out of a narcissistic relationship, I would highly recommend her trauma bond recovery course. You can find it in the link in bio on any of her social pages, also on her website. She has a great journal, which was actually, I found her videos and then I ordered her journal right away. That's how I know Lisa. But Lisa has a lot of great things to offer, not only her content on social, but you can also visit her website, and she is also a coach. And today I really wanted to tackle the conversation, what if you stay? What if I stay? Should I stay? Because I think we all asked ourselves that at some point. And yes, there are people who manage to stay in these relationships for 20, 30, 40 years. It is incredibly challenging and damaging, but I'm also not going to ignore the fact that, I was in it for 5 years. So I asked myself that question many times and I made all those excuses for myself. And I think we've all been there in that moment, but I wanted to bring in somebody who could really shed some light on this and we can look at all sides of the conversation. So thank you, Lisa, for joining me again.
My pleasure. I'm so excited to be back. I had a great time the first time talking about the oh so fun trauma bonds and how to break them, how to recover, but not how to stay, but the conversation around why we might choose to stay or delay leaving. It's such an important topic. And I don't think one that people talk about enough, and the difficulty in making the decision.
Absolutely. And the numbers are high of people who actually do stay. I mean, it's hard to believe that these relationships can sustain long-term, quote unquote. I mean, your definition of long-term might be different. Like I was in it for 5 years, but then I hear a lot of people 20, 30, 40 years. How does this long-term even happen with a narcissist?
I think first and foremost, the people who stay, and I'm generalizing intentionally, but the people who stay often don't know that they're being abused. And that is probably the most interesting side of the conversation, because we talk about people stay for financial reasons. People stay because of children. People stay because they don't know they're being abused. That's the primary reason. And that's the thing that we aren't talking about enough of, because we don't know that it's abuse. We don't recognize what abuse looks like and how it presents. We think often, if you're being abused, you have a black eye or that you are being physically harmed. Even perhaps some people think that if he or she is screaming at you, then, okay, well, that's verbal abuse. That's the closest we get normally publicly as a society. But what we don't look at are the smaller ways, the covert ways in which narcissists and abusers who are not narcissists, but the covert abuse that's happening and the gaslighting where you have been convinced that you are the problem or that there isn't a problem and you've made it up. That is the primary reason we stay, lack of knowledge.
Right. It was interesting. There was a comment on one of my videos the other day, and she had been in a narcissistic relationship long term. And she said, this is also mind blowing for me because back in the 70s and 80s, we just referred to it as this person's an asshole. But now there's actually a label and tactics, which to your point are so foreign. And most of us, unfortunately, really don't learn any of this until after.
Yes. It's interesting. I almost laughed when you said that word, because it was a friend of mine who is a therapist rather than my therapist, but she said, it's not about the label. Like, this was in the very early stages when I was wondering, is this person bipolar? Is this person multiple personality? Is this person, and I wasn't aware of the labels, the diagnoses, the things that make you fit into these diagnoses. I was just sort of speculating and desperate for a label to make it make sense. And she said, you need to let go of all of the labels and all of the things that it might be. All you need to know is that he's an asshole.
Right.
And it's true. The behavior is what matters. It's not the label. So as we talk about narcissistic abuse, the first thing I invite people to do is let go of the label. I mean, you can call them that, but what I mean by let go is let go of the importance of giving the person a label and just focus on the behavior, how it makes you feel, how it impacts you.
Right. So we're basically saying, which I think is a good a good bit of information and a good tip is like, if it's toxic, then it's toxic. And it doesn't have to be narcissism or cluster B or whatever the label is. I don't think the labels are a bad thing to a degree because they help us understand what we went through. And that for me would be the only reason if there was a diagnosis. For me, the diagnosis was like, it was horrific. But it was also when I started reading about it a little bit too of a light bulb because I didn't have any way to put words to what had happened or to even identify it. I just thought like, how do we have these incredible highs and this great time? And then the lows are just so low and so bad. And what is happening? And I'm left feeling confused. I think that's probably why a lot of us cling to the label because the constant state of confusion.
Yeah. Once you can label it, and when I say label it, I mean label the behavior as abuse. Forget the diagnosis for a moment, but narcissistic abuse is such a niche, specific, or it feels like such a specific kind of abuse that I too was attached to the label. And I think that in fairness, it's easy for me to say, let go of the label at this stage. But at the time when I was in it, I couldn't let go of the label. She was the first person that ever suggested that I let go of it. And in fairness, in hindsight, it was great advice that I didn't take. But it was great advice. I think when we say focus on the behavior, especially for the people that are still in, and when I say choosing to stay, it isn't always a choice, but the ones that don't know, and so they stay because they don't know how bad it is. They're being told that it's not. Narcissistic abuse to me is a lot like an orchestra. There's, an instrument playing and then another and another, and it all works together so beautifully. Really the opposite of beautiful, but, isolation tactics and gaslighting and manipulation and devaluation and love bombing and it all works together to create an experience of abuse that you don't know you're being abused and you blame yourself. And you've been isolated from friends and family, and even people such as me who were not isolated physically, meaning I was quote unquote allowed to see my friends. I definitely was made to feel guilty,
right?
But I still was going. So I wasn't isolated like I had no one physically in my life, but I was isolated in that I was restricted from talking about my relationship because my friends were noticing that there was a problem. So when I talked about it, they would tell me things, and then he would go through my phone, see that I talked to them, and then scream at me for talking shit about him when really I was just stating what happened. And so it isolated me. And then I wasn't able to recognize it as abuse because I protected him from my friends and family's awareness of what he was actually doing. But what I did was protect myself from knowing that it was abuse. So why did I stay for so many years? Because I didn't know that it was abuse. And I chalked it up to, as we all do, the excuses we make, right? Of the person is angry or has childhood trauma, or that victimization happens so early, and it happens in the love bombing stage. So you don't notice it. You see it as vulnerability.
Right. So I want to explore that a little bit. So my situation was pretty similar in that I was allowed to go out and do whatever I wanted, but the isolation almost became self-isolation because, to your point, you were made to feel guilty, or, it was just the tone of the conversation didn't go very well because you had made other plans and, oh, okay, you're doing that. There was negative reinforcement. And for me, I had an experience where I was talking to my friend Liv, and I was simply just telling her something that happened, and it didn't even really make him sound that bad. I didn't think so. It was just a really true statement about me having a tough time about an argument. And I needed a friend, really, is what it came down to. I didn't realize that he was listening to my conversations at home, from another room or across the house. And that turned into, it was my job to make him look good. It was my job to defend him. It was my job to protect this idea of what everyone else had of us. And I started isolating myself. So what is the advice? What would you say in that scenario, so let's say we could dial it back and we were friends. And I said, well, he keeps telling me that like, I need to not talk about him to somebody else, or I need to not share. What happens then? What advice would you give for that person? Because that is the beginning of a lot of really deeply toxic control in the relationship.
It absolutely is. I draw people to the intention behind what benefits the abuser may have, and we'll say partner, because at that, maybe we're not recognizing it as abuser at that point.
Right.
So who benefits from your silence? What does your partner have to gain? Because we know what they have to lose, and that's what we're focused on, what they lose, right? They lose their reputation and friendships or whatever, but what do they gain from your silence? So flip the perspective a bit. And the answer is, and I would help guide them to this answer, they are gaining your isolation, which results in you not knowing. So if you have a friend in particular that's experiencing it and you see it, we often want to swoop in and help and say like, you're being abused, or this isn't right, or this is toxic, whatever the label may be, but you're running in to say you shouldn't be in this relationship because it's so easy to see, but you don't realize the person in the relationship sees it's bad, but not how bad. And they see that it's bad, even somehow bad, but that still isn't a reason to leave for this person. Objectively, it is, but it isn't when you're in it. And I mean, if anyone can identify with that, it's you and me, right? We know that. So it becomes a conversation around what the partner benefits, how they benefit from not having you share the information, and how you yourself are harmed from not having someone to talk to. And I would ask the friend to consider the behavior of their partner and how it impacts them and your own intention. So are you, when you share this information, when you have chosen to go to your friends and say, this behavior is upsetting me, what is your intention?
Right.
Because the abuser wants you to think that you're shit talking. They want you to think that you are slandering them and that you're causing harm. But what they're doing is applying a healthy relationship dynamic and phrase and ideology of, if you are in a, relatively speaking, a healthy marriage, a healthy relationship, is it appropriate to slander your partner every time you get into an argument and start calling them names to your friends?
Right.
Of course not. But we're not talking about a healthy relationship. We're talking about an abusive one. But before you can identify that it's abusive, you don't know that. And now you're applying healthy relationship phrases and dynamics to an unhealthy one. But we don't know that. It's such a catch-22. So I ask people to consider their own intention. Are you trying to slander your partner? Like, is that what you want? No. Are you telling the truth? Yes. I've heard people say, well, I'm telling my truth.
Right.
Maybe I'm not telling his truth or her truth, but I'm telling mine. I don't believe that there are two sides to a story in the context of abuse. I do believe there are two sides. I've heard three sides, right? Yours, mine, and the truth.
Right.
But again, you're applying that to an unhealthy relationship where one of the people is a pathological liar, is a professional con artist. So everything's distorted. But we take these healthy things and we apply it. But more importantly, the abuser is applying it. Don't talk about me to your friends, and don't, and it makes sense to not. Because you think, well, maybe it was just a fight. Maybe I did just overreact. But what's your intention?
I feel like too, the phrase, this is my truth. And I get that phrase, like you said, in other scenarios. But I feel like in relation to abuse, saying, well, this is my truth, is that little caveat of still protecting your abuser.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, because you're by saying it's my truth. Now I understand why we do that. Once we start to realize that there's the abuser has a totally different version, you respectfully say, this is my truth. But what you're saying is that there's two truths out there, and that it's really a matter of perception. In abuse, in my view, there are not two sides. There is one side. There is what happened. That's it. So in my own situation, there was physical abuse, there was emotional, financial, sexual, all of it. That is the truth. The behavior happened. The things that I say happened. So there is one truth. Where we get into different stories is why the things happened, or if they happened at all. But I'm not here to debate reality with anyone, let alone an abuser. So I don't perceive there to be two truths or three truths in the context of abuse.
Right. Being the sort of, I would say, expert in trauma bond in terms of all of these people who are posting content on TikTok, YouTube, all over the place, you really talk about trauma bond and the trauma bonding process more than most and how to recover from it. Do you feel like this is all basically trauma bond? Because as you said earlier, the person in the relationship doesn't always know they were being abused. I knew, as much as I loved him and as much as I was hanging on to it and trying to make it work and doing everything from writing letters to emails to jumping through fucking fiery hoops on a 15-story building. I mean, there wasn't anything I didn't do to try and make this work. Deep down, I still knew there was something intrinsically wrong, and that the way he would react or the fights we would get in or the behavior, and those things weren't 100% of the time. They were less than 50% of the time. But when they happened, it was so not healthy and normal the way I would have experienced in previous relationships that I found all the ways to excuse it because of the 60 or 70% of the other time that was okay. Maybe I'd say 60%. Do you think this inability to recognize that this toxic behavior we're experiencing that truly is abuse is because of the trauma bond? Because we're so bonded to them, we can't see past the behavior to the word abuse?
Yes. In short, yes.
Sorry, that was a really long, drawn out question.
No, but I mean, yeah. When we are trauma bonded, we're just unable to see clearly. And I mean, it's the cognitive dissonance that keeps us, because we know, like, you're talking about two different realities, and we often are living two different realities. The person is abusing you. You may not know the word abuse, but what I'm saying is, something, as you said, is intrinsically wrong.
Right.
But why do you excuse the behavior? Because you want to. Part of it is because you want to, deep down, not consciously. Unconsciously, it is so important to you to believe that you're not, married to an abuser or in a long-term relationship with an abuser, but also that you're not a victim. We don't identify ourselves that way. Insofar as nobody wants to, like, I was abused. Nobody wants to admit that, because what it says, it doesn't say this, but what we think it says is that you are weak or stupid, and that you didn't make a good decision, that you picked badly. You made the wrong choice. And then worse off, when this realization happens, because it never happens in the beginning, it happens later. It was 7 years in that I started to realize something was wrong. And then, of course, in hindsight, I think I realized it sooner, but when it really hit me, 7 years. And there are people who have been in the relationships far longer that are only just realizing it. So not only did you not see it, not only are you, quote unquote, not smart enough to have seen it, you're so stupid that you stayed. So now you're embarrassed and ashamed when, in fact, none of this is true about victims. We are not stupid. We are actually highly empathetic. We are too agreeable. We are too loyal. Agreeable and loyal, great. Too agreeable, too loyal, too trusting. We offer trust without it being earned often. So these are the things about us in why we got ourselves into the situation. But we use that, we're self-deprecating about it, and then we feel bad that we have stayed. So then we punish ourselves by staying more.
And I think what gets really tricky is when the people around you start to see it's abuse or tell you it's abuse, and you still choose to stay. And so one of the tactics that we know with narcissists is that this love bombing, it starts in the very beginning. And I think that comes back into play. Maybe not for everybody, but certainly for me, I was told I was being abused. And that feeling is everything you described. I mean, there's such a connotation to the word abuse, and even to say abuse survivor, domestic violence survivor, there's this feeling of shame that comes along with the attachment to that word. And, when I was told by a therapist, our couples therapist, that I was being abused and asked a series of questions of what I understood and knew about narcissism and narcissists and abuse from a narcissist. Of course, I've said this 1,000 times in videos. I knew nothing. I had to go to Google to learn what was happening, but I made that choice that I was done. I packed everything. But then the love bombing came back. And the love bombing for me was, let's have a baby. I want to do this. So what's your take on that choice? I mean, I know for myself why I made that choice. And I also know the moments that I questioned myself making that choice. But what's your take on what happens to that person in that relationship when, again, they throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at you to get you to stay, and you actually choose your abuser after you start to have some sort of conscious recognition that this is actually abuse?
What I see in my practice is that it relates to a degree to a business term, the sunken cost fallacy. I've already invested 7 years in this. They've promised to change. I'm seeing change, and I'm air quoting that. It's not real change, but I'm seeing what I perceive as change. Maybe they really mean it this time. Part of that, I mean, it's unique in that each person has their own deep reason for making that choice. And it depends on so many different factors. But ultimately, as a rule, I've invested so much time already. We have family, I don't want to break up my family, so I'm going to choose to believe them this time. The love bombing, the hoovering really comes so much stronger every time. And the abuser learns what works and what doesn't work. So just, right. As an example, if finances aren't an issue and they tried to control you with money and that didn't work for them because you have a job and you're, relatively speaking, financially independent, they're not going to keep doing that. They're going to find the thing that works and use that. Yeah. So obligation, guilt, loyalty, those are things that work. Fear of being alone. And then, of course, fear of being murdered is also one. And that's something that, I especially, because I speak about trauma bonds, talk a lot about the emotional reasons that we go back. There's a video that I made once that was just, I think it was like 10 seconds long. And I said, to the people who say, why do you stay? You should just leave. Do you think that makes the abuse stop? That was the whole video. And I forget, it got so many views because it's the truth. It's right. Relatable. People think, okay, you're being abused, just leave. That's not when the abuse stops. In fact, that's often when the abuse really ramps up. We know that the rates of being killed is exponentially higher when you try to leave. And the love bombing and the hoovering and the desperation, all of it goes up so much. You think they manipulate you if you threaten to leave? Try actually leaving and see what happens. And then see if the police will help you and if the family court system will help you easily. You have to jump through, as you actually sort of reference, like hoops of fire to keep yourself safe because the system isn't set up. When I say the system, like everyone that has the potential to help you, right? CPS, police, family court, social workers, therapists, there is an immense lack of training. And that means that we don't know how to help ourselves. We don't know how to recognize it ourselves. And then worse, nobody else knows either. And we're left confused and feeling alone and isolated. And the only voice we hear is our abuser telling us that we're making it all up.
Right. And, there are so many stats out there supporting this. And I think 7 is the sort of given number that most people stick to of, most of us who tried to leave an abusive relationship tried 7 times or more. It's not an easy thing. I mean, you get roped back in for, like you said, so many reasons, whether it's fear-based or emotional, or you're still trauma bonded and you love them, or, like the list is so long of the reasons why. And people do think it's a simplistic thing. But to your point, quite often that's the beginning of a whole other nightmare. And I would guess, tell me if you agree, that the biggest reason people stay is because of the kids.
Yes, I do see that. And I was that. If you have children, children become weapons in every possible way. And breaking up the family is the big looming threat that abusers use. Also using the kids in another way, which is nobody wants a single mom. And that particular weapon doesn't work in the reverse, meaning women don't typically say that to men, right? Nobody's going to want a single dad because that's not true. And that's not how it works. But what female perpetrators will do is say, if you leave, you're never going to see your kids again. So the children are weaponized by whomever the abuser is. And then you want to stay. And I think that I could go on all day about this particular piece of advice, but we stay for our children. You need to leave for your children. Children grow up, and I'm overgeneralizing, but the reality for the most part is your child will grow up to be either a victim or an abuser because they're exposed to that. So they're either going to think that the dynamics they see are normal and then fall into those same patterns, or little boys in particular witnessing their father be abusive to the mother, they often will grow up with the same misogynistic viewpoint and the entitlement, especially exacerbated by the fact that the patriarchy in society helps feed that. But that is where abusers are born. Not narcissists specifically, but male abusers are born from watching male abusers, and males in society behave that way. Where narcissists, there's a predisposition to it, which is then furthered by the environment. And that's the real trigger, is the environment. But we can't stay for our kids. We have to leave. And I use 50-50 as a custody arrangement. It may not be 50-50, but hear me out. If you are fearful of leaving because you're going to have to do 50-50 with an abuser and leave your children, and I'm a mother, so I want to say this I'm not speaking from a place of not understanding this. I have walked this walk. At least 50% of their life will be with you, happy, healthy mother or father, happy and healthy. And yes, they will have 50% of their life witnessing abuse. Now, I actually want to interrupt myself and say I'm not talking about physical abuse because that's a very different thing. I'm talking about emotional and psychological abuse. Leaving your children in an environment where they're either witnessing that or receiving that. You're either leaving them with you in the house, witnessing it 100% of the time, or you leave and they only witness it 50% of the time. So you have to look at it as a step in the right direction. And then you have to use the family court system for the mess that it is. You have to use the system to help build a case to show that they are not emotionally safe. And sometimes you can't. That is to say, as a mother, I can relate to the ridiculousness of asking someone to ignore the fact that their child is experiencing neglect or abuse 50% of their life. But at least you can show them how to cope with it. At least you can show them that you have an option to be happy and healthy because I'm living it. I'm the example now. So staying for your kids is always a mistake. It only hurts kids. It hurts kids in 100% of cases.
Is there any way of showing kids? So, obviously today's topic is the what if I stay, which the other side of that is all the reasons why you shouldn't stay, which you and I know all the reasons why staying is, I hate to say this, it sounds so extreme, but it really is a death sentence on so many levels. And I don't necessarily mean that in a physical term. I mean that in an emotional term. I was told staying with this person is emotional suicide, and I nearly hit the floor when I heard that phrase. And he wasn't wrong. So what do you do? What can you do? Because you are blessed to be a mom. Unfortunately, I'm not, but you have that insight. Is how do you support your children if A, you decide to stay in it, which I know the goal is not to stay, or B, if you decide to leave or you are leaving or in the process of leaving, what are the steps that you take to ensure that your child knows the difference? Because to your point, statistically, we do know that abuse is born by witnessing abuse in a home.
Mm-hmm. So my answer, actually, I can answer whether you choose to stay or leave. My advice is the same.
Okay.
Which makes it easier. So if you can, and trust me when I say I understand that there's a cost associated with what I'm about to say, and not everyone has access to this, but therapy is ideal for children of any age to have someone to talk to about not abuse, but about, although potentially, depending on age and what they've seen, but how to be learning how to set boundaries, learning how to ask for their needs to be met, learning how to identify their needs, learning how to identify their feelings. So my children are 4 and 6 right now, and they've been in therapy for a year each, and they're learning how to identify feelings because that's how little they are. Your children are older, they can identify their feelings, but can they? Because often feelings are dismissed by abusers. So do they actually know? And I'll give an example of anger, and it's, kind of therapy 101, but children get angry. Why? There's so many reasons. Anger is not really a real emotion. Anger masks the other emotion: frustration, worry, sadness, anxiousness.
Isn't anger
pain.
just a reaction to the emotion?
It's a reaction to the real emotion. So it comes out as anger.
Right.
So if you have a child who is acting angrily, there's a reason, there's an unmet need underneath that. So you talk to your children about anger and empathy and compassion. So especially for the parents such as me that are so concerned with, like, is my child going to grow up to be an abuser or a narcissist? What do I do to protect my child or children? And really it comes down to talking about it. So, all kids do this, but, my son smacks my daughter, as siblings do. And it isn't, he's punished for hitting her. It's, let's talk about how she feels, but let's also talk about how you felt. What made you feel so upset that you hit your sister? Is that okay? Why isn't that okay? How do you think she feels? So I think, a good place to start is talking to the child about their own feelings, and then identify it, then move into how someone else felt in response to their action, so that they learn empathy and compassion. And even in teachable moments out in the world of, you're at a playground and another kid unrelated to your own family falls and cries. You don't even know that child. It's a stranger. Mm-hmm. But you can say to your child, how do you think that little kid feels? How do you think she feels? She just fell off the swing. Oh, she probably feels sad. Right. Is there anything that we could do? I wouldn't encourage him to go hug a little girl, but, go offer her something, ask if she's okay. But it's a matter of teaching those things. There's also games you can get, Feelings in a Flash is a flashcard game to play with kids, where you can talk about scenarios and then identify how people might be feeling. Has kind of I don't know if you know the game Apples to Apples, but it's like that, but about feelings and for kids. But it's, there's so many different ways to talk to kids about it. And I'm talking about this while you're in the relationship or out. You are teaching them about boundaries. Another thing that's really important is we all have this desire to have our children see the other parent for who they are, while simultaneously wanting to protect them from who the other parent actually is. So you're in a catch-22. There's no right answer. But I'll tell you to get on board with the fact that you can't protect your children and they're witnessing it. You can pretend that it's not happening all you want, but they're still seeing it. And so not talking about it is only making them think that it's okay and making them feel invalidated. So where a child might say, does daddy hate me? And I've heard that many times. The answer isn't yes or no. The answer is something along the lines of, I'm sorry you feel that way. Tell me more. What makes you feel that way?
Right.
That must be so hard. Sounds like you're really hurting. Not, yeah, that's daddy. He must. Daddy doesn't love you. Daddy sure doesn't act like it. You don't want to say anything negative, because the kids are going to grow up and they internalize that. They're not emotionally capable at a certain age. Of course, as they get into teens, they become more capable. So I'm all about age-appropriate truth, not protecting the abuser, you're protecting your child. And if you can't see the difference, you're still angry and you are putting your anger and your desire to out your ex or current partner over and above raising healthy children. So it's a hard thing to face. And I see it every day. And I did it myself where it's like, of course you want that. You know,
Right.
why don't we see daddy? Because he sucks. But you can't say that. So you can't say these things to children at any age. I don't care if they're 17, 24, or 4. You can't say that. You have to just say, I'm sorry you feel that way. I understand. You can even say, I would feel that way too. Not, I'm sorry you feel that way. I've had somebody actually it's not funny, but like sort of a abuser say that. I'm sorry you feel that way. Like that's not taking ownership. But you're not taking ownership for the way that they feel. You didn't make them feel that way. The abuser did. But you teach them boundaries, empathy, compassion, feelings, how to stand up for themselves, not just with that parent, right? We hyper focus on when you're interacting with daddy or mommy, be like this. In life, it's a life skill for everything and every interaction they have. If you feel uncomfortable at the doctor's office, you have the space to speak up. You can say something. Your feelings matter. So focus on making your children feel like they matter. They'll learn that skill. And then whether you stay or go, they have a skill, a lifelong skill to cope with their parent and with people like this. Because it's not just our parents and intimate relationships, right? We see these dynamics at work, friends, it's everywhere.
And I think identifying the abuse and one of the lessons teaching children, something that was really bizarre to me is that a narcissist in many cases, they have a very black and white view of the world. And I used to say all the time, like, there's a gray area. There's a gray area. But, you know, even when he would describe me or my emotions, why are you mad? I'm not mad. No, you're mad. No, I'm not. I'm actually hurt. So I would need to explain the range of emotions that I had because there seemed this inability to identify that there was more than just happy, which all narcissists really want you to say positive, happy all the time, which is a bizarre place to live because it's not real, or they think you're angry or mad. And to me, that black and white behavior is a great way to identify abuse, but also, such to your point, an important lesson for children. Because if you are making that choice to stay because of the children, they need to understand that life is not black and white, that we're not always happy with you, angry with you. And that too kind of ties, I guess, back to what you're saying, teaching them the spectrum of emotions and being able to identify or talk to them. Because unfortunately, with a narcissist, your emotions are used as a weapon.
Mm-hmm. Always a weapon. And it happens to the children. It happens to anyone around them. So you want to build up kind of an arsenal of coping tools to battle that weapon, to learn how to disengage, to learn how to see a person as abusive and remove yourself, even if it's a parent. And I haven't had to do that. I don't have narcissistic parents that I need to avoid. And I can appreciate the difference in breaking up with a partner versus a parent.
Right.
But the skill set is the same of really setting those healthy boundaries, holding those boundaries, because you know that you are worth it. You know that your feelings matter. But if you're raised to think that your feelings don't matter, then being in an abusive relationship probably feels comfortable. Not good, right? Just comfortable.
Right. Just that it's that what you've normalized.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's take it from a totally different angle for a second. So, like you said, most of us in the relationship didn't realize or didn't want to recognize or kind of fought the signs or whatever it is that it is abuse. How do we, as people in the life of the survivor or the victim who's actively seeing this is abuse, how do we approach it? Because so oftentimes, and this is really, I mean, personally, I felt like this is one of the fucking worst things ever, that people say to you, oh, I saw it. Oh, I thought, this wasn't right, or he was controlling, or, I saw changes in you and I didn't know what to say. None of that is helpful. It's just not. It's not helpful after the fact of somebody who's had to go through hell to then later say, oh, I saw it. But what if you see it actively? It's happening now. This person's in the relationship. What advice would you have for this person who's seeing this and doesn't know what to do. Should they say something? Should they not say something? How do we get to the place where the person recognizes it's abuse?
So there is probably no harder question for people who are witnessing a friend or family member be abused and how to deal with it. And I know that generally speaking, the gut feeling is like, you're being abused. How do you not see that this person is abusing you? Or you might take a softer approach, but you're still saying the same thing of like, this is so clearly abuse. You need to leave. He's awful. She treats you so badly. You should leave. That's not helpful. So then to answer your question, what is helpful? It comes down to, again, the validation, because one thing that I have learned in the last 2.5 years of my own journey is the validation is so much more important than we would have ever realized in somebody saying, I see you, I hear you, I believe you. So first and foremost, believe them if they're coming to you. But if they don't see it, or you're attempting to address it and bring it up, and let's say you recognize it as abuse, that label, I wouldn't diminish it and call it toxic, because I think there's a very distinct difference between toxic and abusive, and calling it toxic just feeds into like, oh, toxic relationships, when that's not. Abuse requires intention and a power imbalance. So identify the behavior that you see. If you are able to label it as like, that's an isolation tactic, that is manipulation. But if you can only see it as bad or abusive, I would be drawing on experiences of, you remember last weekend when he something, that upset you? Because I saw it and it kind of bothered me. How did you feel? You're just opening the door to a conversation and letting them know that I see something.
And that they're safe. Because we don't feel safe to talk about it.
Exactly. But what makes people not feel safe is someone saying like, it's abusive, you should leave. Why are you with him?
Yes. Then
you're like, okay, so now you vent and you say to this friend, you're right, this person's awful. I can't believe I'm with this guy. He's such a jerk, whatever. Okay, you're right, I should leave. But then you decide to stay, or you decide for now to stay, or you can't decide. So you're still in the relationship. You don't want to talk to that person anymore. And worse, sometimes we make this mistake. Often we make this mistake. My friend Ashley said, you're abusive. Well, guess what? Now your abuser doesn't want you to ever speak to Ashley ever again, because Ashley is a bitch. So now you took the one person who sees you and you've made it so that they can't help you. So as a friend, you don't want to be the person that starts saying you should leave. You just say, I'm here if you need to vent. I'm here if you need anything. In what ways can I support you? Rather than, what do you need? Money? A place to stay? They don't even know what they need. So just offer them whatever you have. Because maybe, like I've used my sister as an example. She's the person who would help you financially. She would give you a place to stay. She would let you vent to her, but she's not the person that can give you back a lot of compassion and empathy, because she doesn't get it. She doesn't understand. Don't get me wrong. Logically, she can understand what a trauma bond is, but she can't. She truly can't. Some people can empathize even though they haven't experienced it. That's not my sister. So what is she good for? Plenty of other things. So she knows, and I know, but luckily she herself knew where she could offer support. And so that's what she offered.
Right. You know, and I think that conversation is so hard in general for the person in the relationship, because I don't know about you, but I felt like little boy cried wolf because of this so many times that I had said to myself, okay, this isn't right, I'm done. Or, I caught him cheating again, or whatever it was. Like all these things that now in hindsight, you could look at them on a piece of paper and say, well, how could anybody excuse all of that all this time? But it's so different when you're actively in it. And for all the reasons that we've discussed, it's so different. But when I packed up the car, I didn't tell anyone, because I felt like I'd reached that point of little boy cried wolf, that 7 or more times where you keep trying and trying to get out and people around you recognize that it's abuse, but you can't bring yourself to actually follow through. And I think that little boy cried wolf holds people back from saying, this is what's happening and I'm scared.
Yeah. You can't tell people that you're going to leave again, or that you're unhappy again, or that he cheated again or hit you again because you've been through this and you're quote unquote choosing to stay. And one of the biggest messages in my own platform, and why when I talk about what I do, I am an expert in trauma bond recovery, but abuse education is key. And I make plenty of videos that are just put out into the world for the sole purpose of, I hope this hits the pages of people who need to hear this. I hope that this message of why people stay, because victims and survivors don't necessarily need to know why we stay. Some of us know. It's the friends and family
Yes.
that need to understand that now if you hear that someone or if you witness abuse, meaning even emotional abuse, if you're like, ooh, my friend is in a bad relationship, and then a year later you're like, she hasn't told me anything bad recently, don't just assume that it's because nothing bad is happening. It could very likely, more than likely, in fact, be that they've vented to you so many times that now they feel stupid for staying, so they just don't tell you anymore. It's not even your fault. You could be the safest place in the world for them to go, and they're still not going to tell you. There's such nuance, isn't there? It's so difficult.
And for me, the thought too is that it's worse. If they haven't told you, that means it's continuing to get worse.
Yes, and they're embarrassed and ashamed.
Exactly. They're embarrassed. They don't want to say anything.
Yeah. There was a night where I was choked, climbed on top of me, trigger warning, and choked me. And I remember thinking that I was going to die in that moment. I couldn't breathe, obviously. And he was sitting on my chest, just like hands around my throat, slamming my head into the nightstand behind me. And I remember thinking like, I'm going to die. And so I don't know what happened, why he just let go. I'm not sure what sparked that for him to just stop. But when he did, I jumped up, ran out of the bedroom, grabbed my purse, which just happened to be on the staircase, no coat, in the winter, ran out the front door, jumped into my car and drove away. And I told a friend about it. And I met with her and we talked about it, but I stayed. So she told me to leave and I stayed. So now I didn't listen to her. And I honestly was a little bit afraid that she would be mad at me. She wasn't, but I'm just saying, I thought she would be mad at me for staying because I did it to myself. Who stays? What kind of idiot would be choked and then stays? Me. I'm that idiot. And we're all that person because he was just angry. Maybe I did something to set him off. So I actually stopped talking to my friends about what was happening as much.
Yeah. Well, I collect myself after that. God, it's just insane.
That wasn't even the worst thing that happened, but you stay. And to be honest with you, the second really bad incident of physical abuse, I did not tell anyone, weirdly, except that same friend. I told her, and it was 2 years later. I never told her about the stuff that happened in between, but I told her. Didn't tell my sister, didn't tell my mother, didn't tell the police, didn't tell anyone, because he was just angry and I needed to figure out what I was doing wrong to make him so angry, you know. And at that point, obviously, with the way the abuse was going, there was a lot of sexual coercion happening. So then I'm like, well, maybe, as he tells me, he's just sexually frustrated. So this is why this is happening. And if I could just get on board and realize that in marriage, you sleep with your partner and that's how this works. And in long-term relationships, this is what you need to do. That's, in my mind, it was like, I'm supposed to sleep with my partner. I'm supposed to want my partner. So why don't I? There's something wrong with me. And because there's something wrong with me, this makes him angry. And because of that, he's abusive towards me. Do you see how that's my fault?
Right.
In the, in the brain of a survivor. And then it just keeps happening. I made excuses all the way through couples therapy. And, it was only until there was a threat to my children in terms of me being able to keep my children, because I continued to make bad decisions that was impacting them, that I really got my head slightly on straight. But it takes a lot. Going back to what you said about it taking 7 times, that's the average. So it can take less and it can take more. But I think that the nice thing about knowing this average is that if you have tried to leave once or twice, I'm not saying, hey, don't worry, you've got more chances, because it is important to leave. But just know that we're all we have all or are all struggling with the same decisions of to stay, to leave. And there are resources out there, including domestic violence hotlines. If you can't afford private coaching, private therapy, and even then I would say therapists are not trained to look for this. So sometimes therapy is not even the thing that's going to help you.
Right. So as we start to wrap up, and we know all the reasons to leave, what does it look like when you choose to stay?
Great question. My take on it is that, and actually I will draw a bit from Dr. Ramani's book, Should I Stay or Should I Go?
Can we go back 1 second? Because you cut out. So I'll ask the question again and then you can answer. Sorry, you like froze for a second, cut out, and I don't want to miss this information. Okay, so we know what it looks like, all of the reasons to leave. But talk to me about, what does it truly look like when you make that choice to stay?
It's a very difficult and personal decision. And so I'm going to draw a bit from Dr. Ramani's book, Should I Stay or Should I Go? She has a chapter on what it looks like to stay. And I think that it's an important chapter, and I've read it. But in summary, I think what I took from it personally was that you need to manage your expectations. So you need to let go of the idea that you can change them. You need to let go of the idea that therapy will help or that anger management will help. Let go of that and manage your expectations. An abuser and or a narcissist, which are two different things, they will take advantage. They are predatory, and it will mean that you will be abused for the rest of your life. As long as you choose to stay in the relationship, the dynamics that you're seeing will be the dynamics of your relationship. And so if you're choosing to stay, I would say try not to be antagonistic, but certainly stand up for yourself as much as is safe to do so. Particularly when I say this, I'm really talking about the emotional and psychological abuse, because physical abuse, don't stay. Don't stay. Right. But if you're wondering if it's not that bad, if the person's serially cheating on you, this is what the pattern will be. It's never changed. It's not going to change. So accept that this is the life that will be happening. Stop trying to change the person. They don't want to change. They're unwilling to change, potentially incapable of change. Though I do more lean to subscribe to the ideology that anyone can change. I don't mean that narcissists can become cured. I mean, the behaviors can improve, but they have to want it so badly, because it's even harder for abusers and narcissists to even make an attempt to change. It's hard enough for just the average person. So just accept that this is what life looks like, what you're experiencing, how you're feeling. You need to have such a strong sense of self. I recommend that person, the victim, get into therapy and start to work on themselves and love themselves as much as they can in the relationship. Personally, my view is that if you do that, the natural result will be that you do leave. So stay, tell yourself you're staying, but while you do that, learn how to love yourself. It takes a long time. Learn how, and eventually you will love yourself, and then you won't stay. You're only choosing to stay because you have a block or a fear or guilt. There's a reason. Obviously, we didn't really touch on the financial reasons that people stay. That's a bit different because that's not as much of a, staying never feels like a choice, but certainly when there are true blocks, like you have no money, no access at all. But even then, there's domestic violence shelters, and it's difficult. I'm not saying it's easy to go, but there's always a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are always resources. There was a woman who was messaging me months ago and was saying that she was in it and had been in it long term, like 30 years. She'd been in it for a long time. And, financial abuse was a big part of it. She didn't have any money of her own. She had been a stay-at-home mom, and she wasn't able, in her mind, she wasn't able to leave. And Catherine Kleiss was on and said, that there is no version of not being able to leave. You may not like what it looks like. You may not want to take, the options that are there for you, but they're there. And, I was so proud, devastated, all of the emotions when I got a message the other day and she said, I left. It took me 3 months after messaging you, and it doesn't look like what I want it to look like. And it probably doesn't. And it may be a domestic violence shelter, but there are resources. And to your point, not everybody can afford the things that we are lucky enough to be able to afford, like a great trauma therapist who gets it. But to your point, there's hotlines. You can go to Google. There's so many resources. I think Facebook is a great resource because there's so many meetups and groups that focus on narcissistic abuse or domestic violence. There are definitely resources out there if financial abuse is part of it, and that can help you to create that plan to get out. Because I think, to your point, it's just the biggest side effect of all of this, that breaking down your sense of self, the fact that you leave not knowing who you are anymore, the fact that everything in your life has felt diminished and destroyed. And to your point, if you decide to stay and get into some sort of therapy, once you start to figure out who you are again and regain your sense of self, that's when you start to see that you deserve better.
Mm-hmm. That's the key to it, is really believing it. Because I identify with, if you'd asked me, I love myself. But if I did, I would have not stayed. And I admit that I didn't have the financial issues that some people have, although I was absolutely destitute when I left. When I say financial issues, I mean, I was in a position to borrow money, and not all of us are. But I very much agree with Catherine's perspective on, there is always a way to leave. You may just not like what that looks like. Because,
right,
it's not an easy option to say, well, let me take my 3 children to a domestic violence shelter when I live in a small town and the shelter is a 4-hour bus ride away and I don't even have bus fare. Like, I'm not suggesting that it's easy.
Right. And the goal is for it to be temporary.
Exactly.
Right? The goal is temporary, because as you work on yourself, as you build community, as you find your footing, you will get back on your feet again. Yes. And so I ask every guest, which I've asked you before, what's the one piece of advice that you would give somebody in it? But I would say this time, let's ask it just slightly differently. What is the best piece of advice for someone who's trying to take the steps forward?
Who's trying to take the steps forward to leave?
Yeah.
A little bit of it is trust that that feeling of something is wrong. Trust it, and relentlessly pursue a way to find your way back to yourself and to your own happiness. Like it's life or death. You mentioned it being a death sentence, either truly or metaphorically, in fairness. And I agree with you. It depends on your situation, but it is life or death. And you need to relentlessly pursue your freedom. Like it's the only thing that matters, children or not. It's the most important thing you'll ever do for yourself. Life is always better after you leave. It just always gets worse first. So it feels like life isn't better. You have to realize that you're in the eye of the storm and you have to get through it. You can't get around it. You have to go through it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Lisa. I mean, this was a phenomenal conversation, and one that I hope the people who are listening, it's not just for you. I mean, as Lisa said, this is a conversation for you to share. This is an episode for you to share with friends and family, because we do, all of us at some point have said the phrase, they just don't understand. But these are the resources for the people in your life to understand. And this is a conversation that I think is so important. And Lisa, you can find her all across social media. Stronger Than Before is her handle, as well as her website. And it's .ca versus .com. You can find her at strongerthanbefore.ca. And I tell you this all the time, but hang in there. You got this. If you love today's episode, please leave us a positive review and don't forget to subscribe. And we will be back with more episodes of The Narc Me soon. All right. Hang in there. Bye.